We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, I'm happy to be joined by Senator Ron Johnson from my home state of Wisconsin. Senator, thanks so much for taking the time to chat today.
I want to know why you left God's country.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer.
For D.C.?
Right. For the swamp.
Glad you're here.
Yes. Well, we want to start by talking about, and actually this is going to be the focus of our conversation, is tech censorship. Now, Senator, you've recently been censored by YouTube, which means you've been censored by Google. Tell us about what has unfolded over the course of the last several days.
Well, it's pretty much been the same phenomenon. I tell the truth. It's the truth. As I call them, the COVID gods don't want to hear. And the COVID gods, by the way, are led by Dr. Fauci and the agency heads, the Biden administration, and then their lackeys in the media and social media. And for whatever reason, during the COVID crisis, they don't want to allow any second opinions. There is one narrative when it comes to COVID, and it's the narrative that Dr. Fauci wants to push. And so, I'm 66 years old. As long as I've been alive, when it comes to a serious illness, I would consider COVID a very serious pandemic.
Absolutely.
I've never downplayed the tragedy that is COVID. I've always heard you should get a second, maybe third opinion. And so very early on in the pandemic, the first time I heard that there may be a cheap, generic, repurposed drug that could be helpful. As a matter of fact, a drug that Anthony Fauci, I think it was in 2005, discovered that in vitro, this kills off the original SARS virus. Well, this could end the pandemic before it even really leaves the barn. I've been pushing for early treatment. And so that connected me to a global network of preeminent medical doctors and medical researchers that have another opinion, that have had the courage and compassion to actually treat COVID patients. And so, when I find somebody that I know that has COVID, I connect them with one of those doctors. And I have now repeatedly seen how these early treatment protocols, and they're multi-drug protocols. It depends on the progression of the disease. It also depends on how early you start treatment. Some of these doctors, I think it was Brian Tyson out on the West Coast, he's one of the first ones. I had his partner, George Freed, testify in November. By the way, when I held that hearing, myself, Dr. Peter McCulloch, Dr. Harvey Risch, the senior epidemiological professor at Yale, right? No slouch, George Freed, Harvard trained. The New York Times all referred to us as the snake oil salesman of the Senate. And by the way, Dr. McCulloch already had contracted COVID because he was treating patients and he was putting his own life at risk. And you got the New York Times and the Democrat Witness calling him snake oil salesman. It's sick what's happened. But anyway, I digress.
An important digression.
So the result of my contact with these doctors is I am exposed to all kinds of different concerns, ideas, medical treatments, that the closed-mindedness of the Faucis of the world, it's just jaw-dropping. I could go on forever, but I'm very careful, or I certainly try to be very careful, at only talking in the public about things that have been verified. Probably the biggest thing I've been censored for is the fact that I'm just on, for example, radio hits. I just quote the numbers on the VAERS system, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and the FAERS system. FDA has a similar one for drugs. Right. The VAERS is for vaccines, FAERS is for drugs. And so when I say, for example, the drug that many of these doctors are really thinking is a wonder drug in this case, and you take a look at how it's being used in, for example, India or Mexico City or whatever. There are plenty of examples where this looks pretty effective. Ivermectin. It's the drug that the FDA trashed, that Merck, the company that patented it. And remember, this is a Nobel Prize-winning drug. It was termed by the World Health Organization a miracle drug. It saved I don't know how many lives because it's an anti-parasitic, but it has other properties, as so many drugs do. It, over 26 years on the FAIR system, has 15 deaths on average reported per year in association with ivermectin. Now, again, both FAIRs and VAERS, the two big criticisms is they don't prove causation. Understand that. So, I mean, even though those are 15 deaths reported, doesn't necessarily mean that ivermectin caused those 15 deaths.
Right.
But again, 15 deaths. Hydroxychloroquine is about 70 per year deaths reported. 70. The annual seasonal flu vaccine, on average, is about 80 deaths reported on the VAERS system per year. You know what we're up to on the COVID vaccine in less than a year?
What is it?
19,500. Nothing to see here. By the way, almost close to 6,000 of those deaths have occurred on days 0, 1, or 2 following vaccine. Now, again, it doesn't prove causation.
Right.
But it's something I'm concerned about. It's something other people that use their own minds and their own eyes and ears, and they look at that and they go, well, that concerns me. I mean, these people aren't stupid. They also recognize what a deadly disease COVID can be, particularly if you're elderly, particularly if you have comorbidities, but not particularly if you're like a child. Mm-hmm. So, I just have belief in individuals using their brains, their own rationalizations, their own decision-making, their own health autonomy, their own freedom to make those decisions for themselves, but that's not allowed. And so I get censored for that.
Yeah, VAERS is an interesting question because there's this obvious dichotomy of whether VAERS proves causation, which, as you say, that's not proven on VAERS. But at the same time, why would YouTube censor somebody for pointing out that there are things to pay attention to in the VAERS system? VAERS, how seriously should people be taking that 19,000 number, given that they may not be all verified and they may not all be related to COVID? When you look at that number, what does it say to you?
Well, so the other criticism about VAERS is it dramatically underreports. There was this Harvard study said it only reports about 1% of adverse events. Now, I think with COVID, because people are talking about it, but it's not easy to upload it. And doctors really aren't using it all that much from, the reports I get. It's kind of incumbent on people to report it themselves. And, most people, a lot of my colleagues have never heard of it when I bring it up. So if you're at 19,500, I've seen other analyses saying it's probably maybe 10 times that in terms of, I don't know. But all I know is VAERS is 19,500. By the way, total adverse events has now exceeded 900,000. And the drug of choice, the one that Fauci actually paid attention to, the one that the pharmaceutical companies can make thousands of dollars per dose. It costs over $3,000 per treatment, remdesivir. Mm-hmm. The studies on it are incredibly weak, by the way. Right. But that's fine because it's putting a lot of money in big pharma's pockets. That has over 1,600 deaths reported on the FAIR system so far. 1,600. And again, ivermectin's 15, hydroxychloroquine averages 70, flu vaccine's 80, remdesivir is over 1,600. The the COVID vaccines over 19,500. Which one do you think you ought to be a little concerned about? And the FDA and the CDC and maybe even the news media ought to pay attention to it. And I think what the reason I am so passionate about this.
I was going to ask that.
Because my advocacy for it, people are contacting me. They're reaching out. They want some help. For example, the vaccine injured. They just want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want to be believed. A classic, I'm going to say an evil example of censorship was when, after my June event in Milwaukee, where I had Ken Ruckers, the former Green Bay Packer Hall of Fame linebacker, who called me up because I'm outspoken about these things. His wife suffered the vaccine injury, the neurological symptoms. She was part of a Facebook group of about 2,000 people.
From a COVID vaccine or from
the COVID vaccine. Okay. Some of these people, that's how I got in touch with Brianne Dressen, who was part of the AstraZeneca file, and Maddie DeGarry, little 12-year-old girl, now she's 13. She's in a wheelchair. She can't eat. She has a feeding tube. She was part of the Pfizer trial. Those companies have completely cast them aside. They're not paying for their medical bills. They're just completely ignoring them. They've, I think Dree's adverse event was even left out of the information reported to the FDA. So anyway, once we held that event, Facebook dismantled, within about 2 or 3 days, their group of about 2,000 grew to about 5,000 because people heard of this and they wanted that support group. There were a couple of women that committed suicide because the inner vibrations are so severe. So they got this group and they're helping people, counseling them not to commit suicide, and trying to find medical treatment, trying to get noticed so that the authorities and their doctors will admit what the root cause of their maladies are so they can treat them. And Facebook dismantled their support group. They dismantled their groups. I mean, that was, Bree Dressen, who has done so much counseling, some personal friends of hers on this group have committed suicide. She, in our November event, she read the final email she got from one of her friends who committed suicide. She said, Bree, I apologize. I can't take this anymore. You have to carry on for me. I think the same event, Bree said, she knew of within those groups, didn't know them personally, something like a dozen more people had committed suicide. These inner vibrations, this neurological harm is so severe, it's causing people to end their life. And yet Facebook dismantles their groups so they can't stay in touch with each other, that they can't counsel people not to commit suicide. And of course, Fauci and Janet Woodcock and Francis Collins, the COVID gods in the health agencies, completely ignored, and as do the drug companies. And it's even probably more, as outrageous as it is for our health agency authorities. This is their job. They're the ones that approve this on emergency use. They ought to be looking into these at least suspicious adverse events. They're just blowing them off, but it's the drug companies. It's their drug. They're making billions. They won't even cough up the money to pay for the medical treatment. So the people in their trials, no, this is outrageous. So you can see my passion build here, because I've met with him. I've heard the stories. I've hugged Ernest, who's sobbing because he lost his 16-year-old son, his only son. He's a single dad. His best friend in life died shortly after getting the vaccine. So again, I'm personally affected by it.
Absolutely. And then it gets to this question of, even if any particular event wasn't connected to the COVID vaccine, which we don't know, even if it wasn't, how does Facebook shutting down a support group make it better? How does it make our conversation about the science and about the information better? Does it not just make it worse?
Well, from their standpoint, because they have an agenda. They want the vaccine in every arm. I don't know for sure why, but it sure seems to me like they are using the vaccine to be able to control human behavior. I mean, what better way to control individuals if you've got to have a vaccine passport, and you haven't got the 4th booster. You're not to snuff with, you haven't got the 6th booster yet. We're not going to allow you into grocery stores. We're not going to, they could so control and restrict your life and your freedom. They're already doing it. Mm-hmm. Americans have to wake up to what's happening around the world. They're basic internment camps in Australia. Germany has put out, basically quarantining all unvaccinated individuals. And you have to ask yourself, why? If it would be unacceptable regardless, but if the vaccine were 100% effective and once vaccinated, there's no way you could spread it, you could at least argue that the mandates had some purpose. Mm-hmm. But now that we know that even fully vaccinated people with boosters can contract COVID, they can transmit it. In the UK, in a recent 4-week time period, 78% of the people that died of the Delta variant, which is about 80% of their cases, 78% of the people in the UK were fully vaccinated. So what is the purpose of the mandates? This is so bizarre. This makes no sense whatsoever. other than they want to use the vaccines to control. And by the way, there's an excellent video of Anthony Fauci and Richard Bright. And by the way, it was Dr. Bright, who was head of BARDA, that sabotaged the emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine. He was asked to do this through a different procedure to make it available for doctors, and he didn't want to do that. So he instead wrote up, or had FDA write up, an emergency use authorization, knowing that he was basically killing it. So you can use it, but only in the hospital and only as part of a trial. So they just poisoned the use of hydroxychloroquine. Those two individuals are on a panel at the Milken Institute in 2000, I think it's 2019. And they're basically bemoaning the fact that we have yet to come up with a vaccine program that's a universal program, that everybody gets a vaccine. I think they're, in their mind, thinking of flu vaccine. And one of them actually said, yeah, it's going to take a pandemic in order for us to basically accomplish that goal. Well, they got a pandemic, and they're accomplishing that goal. So again, there's so many pieces of evidence here.
What's also
pointing toward that, the use of the vaccine as a method of controlling everyone.
How do you explain the lack of curiosity when it comes to potential treatments and the vaccine itself from people like Dr. Fauci and others? I mean, you can talk about journalists, you can talk about tech executives. They're all taking the vaccine. So what explains why they're so disinterested in having an open conversation about the vaccine?
Well, our education systems, our media, our news media, for decades has been pushing the value of experts, in science.
Yes, Dr. Fauci is on candles, prayer candles.
Every time I hear the term settled science, it's just like fingernails on a chalkboard. I mean, science is skeptical. Science is rarely ever fully settled. We know the Earth's not flat. I mean, there's plenty of science that is settled, but when you're talking about, for example, medical science, I mean, every body is different. There might be a drug that works for 90% of the people, but not for 10, or 50% of the people, but not for the other 50. I mean, if it only works for 30% of the people, is it worth trashing? There are dozens of studies on both hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And you do a meta-analysis of this, and it's looking like it's like somewhere between 60 and 80% effective, depending on whether you give it early or late. So, and again, you compare that to a safety data. Why not give it a shot? So, one of the greatest impediments to early treatment now is the fact that the people will never admit they're wrong. And I mean just generally in the population. I mean, everybody bought into the experts, right? Everybody put their faith in Fauci.
Right.
You kind of don't want to admit that you put your faith in the wrong person or the wrong agencies or in the media and the social media. So just as human beings, we say, God, I took the jab. I really don't want to hear that there may be problems with it.
Right.
Just, I just don't want to hear it. I'm gonna, and that's fine. But the heads of the agencies, the people like Dr. Bright, like that sabotage early treatment, the media and the social media that censored, for example, Dr. Corey's testimony in front of my committee, and so I got called snake oil salesman in the Senate.
Yes.
A month later, I bring in Pierre Corey for the second time. By the way, the first time he testified in May, talking about corticosteroids as opposed to ventilation. I've had doctors come up to me and say, "You've saved my patient's life because of that testimony." That was in May of 2020. So fast forward to December, he comes on. The earlier panel was about a multi-drug approach, using all the above, and there's literally a cornucopia, budesonide. There's a bunch of drugs that people are using successfully, but it is a multi-drug. It's not just one single drug. It's zinc. It's vitamin D. Right. We should talk about vitamin D a little later. But anyway, Pierre Corey was really talking about ivermectin. Some pretty interesting studies came forward. One in Argentina where they prophylaxed 800 healthcare workers. Not one got COVID. Of the 400 that didn't, 58% got COVID. So, well, okay, it's not a random controlled study, but that's pretty strong evidence in light of the fact that ivermectin has such an unbelievable safety profile. Why not give it a shot?
Right.
But YouTube, after his opening statement, his opening statement was powerful because my ranking member Peters was the only Democrat that attended, and he only attended for his opening statement where he trashed Pierre Corey, who's a Democrat, and he basically called him a political hack.
Right.
And Pierre Corey didn't like that, so he came back with forceful, about 10 minutes worth of opening statement. That went viral, 8 million views on YouTube before they took it down. Mm-hmm. So why? Why are they opposed to that information? Why are they opposed to early treatment? Again, is it just because the only solution for COVID has to be a vaccine? If there are early treatments, it may be impossible, if not very difficult, to get an emergency use authorization on a vaccine because that's the way the rules are written. Now, they're breaking rules left and right, so I'm not sure that would have been determinative. And of course, your deaths is over $3,000 a treatment. The vaccine has put billions in the pockets of big pharma. Plus, it's giving these people what they've always wanted, a universal vaccination program that they can use to control everybody's behavior.
Is this an antitrust problem? Is Google getting away with this because they have a monopoly with YouTube? Is Facebook getting away with this? I don't think our legal framework is great for what constitutes a monopoly and doing what Facebook does. But are they getting away with this because of antitrust issues? And if so, and even if not, what can be done?
So the power that the big tech companies have amassed is dangerous.
Right.
And our antitrust laws aren't designed to address it. As I understand them, I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand it, our antitrust laws are primarily designed to consider consumer harm. Mm-hmm. What does a trust do as it relates to? But when you're given all the stuff for free, you don't pay for it all. Okay, right. I mean, it's not exactly free because you're giving all your information. We're just not set up to deal with that. So, in order to do something about this, it's going to I think it's going to require a legislative solution. Mm-hmm. An administration might want to use antitrust laws, could try. They may fail. But I don't see a legislative solution because this works for the Democrats. I mean, you've got Dr. Robert Epstein, mm-hmm. The PhD psychologist from Harvard, voted for Hillary Clinton. He's the one that's pointing out that Google, he has evidence of it because he monitors this. Mm-hmm. They manipulate their search to manipulate your voter preference. And he said it produced millions of votes for Hillary Clinton and for Democrats.
Right.
Okay, so Democrats like that power. And nobody talks about it. The media's not going to report on all their power. Take a look at the censorship of Hunter Biden's.
Yes. Which Jack Dorsey later admitted was wrong. He admitted that Twitter made that mistake.
So, the Hillary Clinton campaign, now we know that from John Durham's report. The Hillary Clinton campaign paid for the Russian disinformation, the Steele dossier. They paid for this whole Alpha Bank mm-hmm. hoax.
Yes.
They paid for this. This is the most consequential political dirty trick in history. So now we know that. And the media was complicit in all that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And tech was complicit in all of it. Just across all of our institutions, there was complicity.
And so the point being is that was all about foreign influence on our elections, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The influence that, and I don't deny, Russia tries to influence our politics. So does China. I mean, we do that to them too. Okay, it's a constant battle. But the interference, the influence over our elections that foreign governments can exert pales. But I don't know how many orders of magnitude versus the interference, the influence of media and big tech.
Yeah.
And again, I've seen the polls. Had Biden voters known about Hunter Biden, Donald Trump would be president for a second term. That's the influence. But again, of course, media and big techs, they're not going to be outraged about that. Democrats aren't going to be outraged about that. And when I talk about it, you get censored.
Right. So, and if the legislative solution isn't workable, because for reasons that I think are very true, what can Republicans do to push back on this? What can Republicans do to course correct not just big tech, but also media and all of these institutions that are working against them?
Well, it's going to take the free market. It really is, and you're seeing that. Parler got shut down because big tech denied them servers,
Yes.
so they got their own server farm and they're back up. YouTube now has Rumble or BitChute. So, at some point in time, conservatives have to use what platforms are out there. I don't think we should abandon those, but we need to start gravitating toward outlets that aren't going to censor us. Now, that's a real shame. I mean, part of the reason we are so divided in this country is we don't have a relatively unbiased, middle of the road mainstream media. The media has gone so far left, as have Democrats. There's no center where the vast majority of Americans, who by and large are pretty open-minded and pretty independent, don't identify strongly, strong right wing or strong left wing, but just pretty open-minded, pretty middle of the road. They got no place to go.
Yeah.
So they have to choose, and so they either choose right-wing media or they choose left-wing media. And there is misinformation on all sides of the political spectrum. There's no doubt about it. So it just polarizes this country.
Yeah.
Now I would argue that I do think outlets like Fox News or the Federalist. I mean, there's a balanced approach here because conservatives, we believe in free speech.
Right.
We want to see both sides of the argument.
Yeah, we embrace it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We're intellectually curious. The left, they say they believe in free speech, but they do everything in their power to stomp it out.
Yeah, and increasingly they won't even say they believe in free speech.
And
well,
look at college campuses. I mean, that should be where free thought flourishes. And now you got the microaggressions, and they're I think the professor that invited Charles Murray wasn't, I mean, this is sick what's happening.
Yeah, and it seems to me that a lot of the problems we're talking about here, tech, all of these things, I mean, you said this, I think, to Wisconsin's NPR affiliate, that if you question anything about January 6th or COVID, you're called a domestic terrorist. And you're on the you're at the top of the Homeland Security Committee. You know what domestic terrorism looks like. Do you think that there really is a push on the left to lump many people, normal people, average people, under that domestic terrorism category? Are you seeing this at institutions like the FBI, former types, CIA types people, the John Brennans of the world? Are you seeing this from your perch in the Homeland Security Committee?
Yeah, so I'm seeing it just as a citizen reading the news.
Yeah.
Watching the narrative. I mean, I got in a lot of trouble for this by pushing back on the thousands of armed insurrectionists. There weren't thousands of armed insurrectionists.
Right.
And to call that an insurrection is, I mean, that it's doing a disservice to like a real insurrection. I mean, you take a look at the Capitol, and you have these people, the armed insurrectionists, staying within the rope lines. Again, I don't deny the violence that occurred. It was repugnant. The racial slurs were repulsive. I condemned it that day. I continue to condemn it. Conservatives condemn that violence. We condemn all violence. But at the same time, I also defend, whether it's the peaceful protesters during the summer or the vast majority of the peaceful protesters on January 6th. I'll defend their right to do that. That's their constitutional right. But again, that's not allowed.